Hi, it's Mr. Evans. Welcome to a real short video on the nature of science. Note, I didn't say the science of nature. That would be ecology or environmental science, but rather the nature of science. What is science? How is it different from history or art? How do scientists think? And what makes something scientific as opposed to pseudoscience? I can probably sum up science with two words, and the first is curiosity. Children are natural scientists. When you were little, you learned about density playing in the bathtub. You learned about biology playing with the family pet or rolling about on the grass in the backyard looking at a flower. You learned about physics, riding a bicycle, learning to ride a skateboard, or learning to kick a football. Children are natural scientists. Children are naturally curious. They ask a lot of questions. Scientists are just little kids who have grown up and are still asking questions. Little kids sometimes take it too far. I'm not sure who left this child unattended with a sharp object and an electrical socket, but please don't try this at home. Science is also driven by ignorance. Now, most people think ignorance means rude. It doesn't. Ignorance means a lack of awareness of or a lack of knowledge. So science seeks to ask questions because we're curious and we're ignorant, and once we've answered the question, we move on to a new question. So, three basic questions scientists might ask. What's there? If I scoop up some pond water and look at it under a microscope, I might see small microorganisms swimming about. What's in there? How does it work? How is it that they are able to swim? What cell structure is allowing them to do that? What chemical reaction is going on inside the cell that powers that swimming? And how did it come to be that way? Science can study events from very, very, very long ago before people were on the planet with some certainty. We'll never know exactly for sure, but we can come to some reasonably good conclusions based on what we can infer from our observations. So, in a scientist's view of the world, there's a couple principles at play here. The world is understandable. Science tries to understand the natural world, not the supernatural world. We try to understand the natural world. The laws that work here on Earth seem to work elsewhere in the universe. Light behaves the same way here as it does on the moon. Gravity behaves the same way throughout the universe. We assume atoms are going to work the same way chemically around the universe. The world is understandable to us. That being said, ideas can change. Science can change as new evidence comes about. Aristotle put forth the idea that the sun was not the center of the solar system, the Earth was. Hundreds of years later, Copernicus challenged that, and then Galileo proved it. So it can take some time, but scientific ideas are temporary and can change as new evidence is brought forth. And science can't answer all the questions. Here's a question for you, quick. Which one's prettier, the lily or the rose? Is that a scientific question? No, it isn't. Science can't answer many questions. We can answer questions about the natural world, but we're not going to be able to make a lot of judgments. All science does have one thing in common. Real science demands evidence. Things are tested, data is collected, and science demands some evidence. If there's no evidence, it's pseudoscience. You're not really doing science. So science develops as we're testing explanations against observations. And this would be a great place to introduce that word hypothesis. A hypothesis is not an educated guess. A hypothesis is a testable explanation. So you might see them written as if-then statements, but if you can't test it, it's not science. It's helpful to be creative. It's helpful to think outside the box. You might come up with a new way to test something. But unless you can actually test it in a lab or in the natural world, it's not useful to us. We need to be able to collect some data to examine. There is a series of checks and balances. Scientists are always trying to avoid bias. Scientists are human, and sometimes they have preconceived ideas, or they get a little too personally invested in an idea and they just can't bear to see that it's wrong. Well, there's a way around that, and it's called peer review. Scientists try to get published in some of these big publications. Nature and Science are the two biggest science publications. These are the top tier. If you get an article published in those, you've really done something. There's hundreds of smaller journals. I just threw up the Journal of Cell Biology as an example. But how does one publish their evidence? We want other people to read what we found out. Well, there's a process called peer review. You've published a paper, you think you've made a discovery. Other scientists working in the same field are going to review it. They're going to ask questions. Was it a large enough sample group? Did you carry out the procedure correctly? Did you consider this, that, or the other thing? Is this really a well-run, well-designed scientific experiment? It's a tough process. There's some serious arguments that go on throughout it, but it is a great process for making sure that science is carried out in the proper way. There's no one scientific method. People approach problems different ways. Sometimes discoveries are made completely by accident, but in the end, there is a process to make sure that what you've done can be replicated, and maybe it even generates new questions for other scientists. And let's take a quick look at the word theory. In pop culture, police, detectives, they use the word theory all the time. I think I have a theory who the suspect is. Well, that's not what a scientific theory is. In science, a theory is a well-substantiated, there's lots of evidence, a well-substantiated explanation for a natural phenomenon. It's not somebody's conjecture, it's not a guess, it's something that's been backed up by many, many, many experiments, and it is a well-accepted explanation. It might change sometime in the future, but generally it's fairly durable knowledge, and it won't be completely discarded. Something will just simply be added on to it. Science is a work in progress. Now, a lot of people have the mistaken idea that this is who does science. And in the past, that might have been true. You might have an image of an old man standing in a lab bench by themselves, working 23 hours a day, just brilliantly fascinated by their topic. Not the reality anymore. Science is a very social endeavor. Women are increasingly, and maybe very soon, in the majority of scientists. They're graduating at college at a much higher rate than males are. Science is a very diverse group. You can't know all of the science at once anymore. That may have been true back in the time of Isaac Newton, but today you can't even know all there is to know in your own field. You work in teams, you work in groups. It's a very social activity. And one of my favorite scientists right here, Dr. Bonnie Bassler at Princeton University, has studied a lot about how bacteria communicate. This is her research team. I think she said the average age of them is about 27 years old or so. She loves coming to work with young people who are full of awesome ideas and come up with new possible ways for her to take her research in a different direction. So in short, science has some basic characteristics. It has to be testable. You have to collect evidence. You have to collect data. It's not a search for the truth. We're simply trying to understand the natural world. So throughout the rest of the semester, I want you thinking like a scientist. And be sure that you come into class tomorrow with some questions for me, because I'd like to hear what you think.